All right, let's call this meeting of the City of West Sacramento's Environment and Utilities Commission to order. And we'll start, as we always do, with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item 1, presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda within the jurisdiction of the Commission. Do we have any members of the public here today? All right. Item 1B, Commissioner Communications. Have there been any? All right. Item 2, consideration of approval of the minutes of the August 12th, 2019 Environment and Utilities Commission, from which I'll abstain since I was not there.
I move we approve the minutes as presented.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, the minutes are approved. Moving to the regular agenda, item 3, consideration of a Verizon collocation agreement. If staff's ready to present.
That's so much better. Thank you. I looked at it. It looked sort of on to me. I thought I had taken care of that. Okay, thank you. Again, John Robinson, Deputy City Manager. The agreement before you is really driven by, like I said, technical changes in the telecommunications industry. The traditional kind of 4G cell tower that we're used to seeing is a technology that's based on kind of larger facilities that are not as close together. So you'll see those. We have one kind of on a windmill-like structure on South River Road. You see them attached to buildings, on flagpoles, just dedicated towers. They cover a broader area, so there needs to be fewer of them. But as more and more devices that require wireless come online, and as new technologies emerge that will demand more bandwidth, there's a need for a new technology that can handle all that usage. And the direction the telecommunications industry is going is small cells or 5G, which has the bandwidth to accommodate devices that need it, and more of those devices, and to do some pretty potentially amazing things in the future. But as kind of a trade-off, it requires many more smaller facilities in order to cover a given area. So even as the existing technology continues to be used, as companies get ready to deploy this new technology in various communities, it's important to have a agreed upon process in place, because each one of those facilities requires permitting and actions from the city. So it makes a lot of sense to have kind of one master agreement that covers how that's to be handled with each provider, as opposed to individually processing dozens of these little permits. So the logical place to put the equipment for 5G and small cell is on existing city infrastructure. So we wouldn't want them going through town and proposing to sink like new poles all over the community. So there's already these facilities that are located at intersections throughout the city. So it's an available place, and the placement of this equipment doesn't impair the city's use of the infrastructure. So that's kind of the nature of the agreement, is to cover the manner in which Verizon, and we'll probably use this document as a base for agreements with other providers, how they would put that equipment onto the poles. So that's essentially it. This has a lot of the granular detail about how we would do that. There will be items coming forward in the future that will cover kind of design guidelines and some of the specific permitting requirements, but this would be the overall agreement with Verizon that would cover kind of the details of how the technology would be deployed. So with that, I'd be happy to try and answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, John. Jose here. A lot of great information. Thank you for that.
The only thing that caught my eye, believe it or not, was on the insurance requirements on page 15. And I noticed that, as you mentioned, you're going to be using existing infrastructure like street lights and utility poles. I'm a little concerned that the policy limit on Section I might be a little low, in my opinion. I guess the liability total is $500,000 per incident. And that, as we know, for workers' comp, it covers not only hospitalization and injuries, medical, but also future compensation. So I'm thinking if somebody falls from a pole or a street light, I mean, we could easily go through that $500,000 pretty quickly. So I would just recommend that you consider maybe upping that to maybe $1 million. Again, that's just my recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
And I've got a question. I'm more concerned with long-term disruption to the community as these different networks are installed. So I'm wondering, how does the network actually get to the poles? And what happens then when the next network wants to come in? I mean, are we tearing up streets, or, how does that work?
Maybe I'll defer to Verizon on that one.
Hi, Dana Diamond with Verizon Wireless. Good question. We've actually already been meeting with the city. We have a standing meeting right now every 2 weeks from 7 to 9 a.m. with city staffers, where we are working diligently to make sure that there is minimal disruption. We even have some areas where they would like us to do night digging, weekend digging, etc., to stay out of the way. But we have a comprehensive plan that we plan to work with the city on. As far as the next carrier, I can't speak to that, but we are being very thoughtful in the community as far as the disruption.
Okay, so, you'd be installing your network, I don't know, in some sort of a conduit, but there's nothing that's like a shared utilidor that could be used to sort of have capability to pull wire in the future simply?
Something that we have found out in the city is that there are actually some conduits that are large enough for everybody to be in. Okay. It depends on the location, of course, but in some areas of the city, there is actually a pretty significant amount of room.
Okay. Thank you.
I have one quick question. How many cell nodes do you anticipate installing throughout the city?
I'm unable to share that this evening because it is proprietary information.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some questions as well, if I may. To the best of your knowledge, are there any potential unintended consequences that might arise from installing these small cell nodes?
So I negotiated the agreement. I have brought with me Dante this evening, and he can go ahead and speak to that question a lot better than I can.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Dante Williams. I'm part of the small cell strategy team. And when you reference unintended consequences, I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure what you're approaching with that question.
Just anything that might impact the community in various ways. That's not likely, but could occur. That we should take into consideration.
One thing I can speak to is that about 70% of 911 calls are coming over the mobile network. Our first responders are using this network quite frequently to improve health and safety in the community. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is shore up the 4G communication infrastructure that we're currently building out. A lot of the small cells I know small cells are typically referencing next generation technology, but what we're trying to do is basically shore up the capacity of the current technology that we're purveying in our network. So we're trying to make sure that all the calls can come through, all text messages can come through our network. So that's what we're doing right now with our network.
Okay. Then I'm not sure who this question would be directed to, but do the nodes generate a notable amount of heat? And if so, are there measures being considered to mitigate risks such as fire?
The nodes are not generating anything that's measurable as far as heat. We are definitely, we have a compliance methodology. We hire a third-party company to measure the RF radiation that comes from our systems. We have a really robust compliance program that's not something that we do on our own. We hire it out to a third-party company.
Okay, thank you. And just out of curiosity, what would happen to the existing cell towers?
So the existing cell towers would still stay in place. So this is a robust network that we're actually trying to shore up. We would keep our existing cell towers in place. Those are over-under network technology. So the small cells are just to offload capacity from the macro network. So in order to make sure that we have enough capacity for all the users and all the different technologies and different utilization things that are coming from IoT and autonomous vehicles, we're also supporting different underlying networks, things like business-to-business communications, machine-to-machine communications. We're actually building a small cell network that will be undergirded by a macro network, so you'll have an under-over technology. So if something ever happens to a small cell, you'll still have the macro network that would back that up. You may lose some capacity, you may lose some throughput, but you'll still have a macro network that has small generators, battery backup, and things of that nature. So we will continue to support that network as far as it goes forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Appreciate the presentation from everyone. Let's move, unless Mr. Robinson has more, let's move to agenda item 4, presentation and discussion on the proposed landscape development guidelines update. Mr. Laffey and Ms. Williams.
Good evening, Chair, members of the Commission. I am Seamus Laffey. I'm a planner in the Community Development Department, and I'm before you tonight along with Wendy Williams, the Senior Civil Engineer in the Engineering Division of Community Development. So we're here before you tonight for your input on the proposed landscape development guidelines. We are looking for feedback from the Commission on the portions of the document within the purview of the Commission, on the entire document, but primarily focusing on our presentation tonight on the local residential streetscape. So I'll start off with a little bit of background on the landscape development guidelines. It's an existing document that was last modified in 1993, and it's incorporated by reference in the city's zoning code, Title 17. The existing document has generally worked well over the years. However, an update is needed to implement General Plan 2035 goals and policies related to sustainability, climate resiliency, crime prevention through environmental design, and to correct some landscaping standards which really haven't worked well. The existing document has sections on parking, land use screening, and streetscapes. The new document retains these subject areas and includes new chapters for low impact development, stormwater management, tree preservation, and planting and irrigation standards, just to name a few. So on the slide are the major sections of the landscape development guidelines that are proposed. The guidelines apply citywide and provide a basic framework for designing landscape areas within private development projects. Community Development Department staff review development plans when they are submitted to make sure they conform with these design guidelines. They do not apply to homeowners of single-family homes. So they apply to large commercial development projects, subdivisions, but not to single-family homeowners. So the guidelines before you tonight for your consideration include a lot of minor improvements and updates to implement the best practices. One of the largest changes that needs to be made and incorporated in this document is to the local residential streetscape. So I'll now turn it over to Wendy Williams to discuss the current requirement for local residential streetscapes and why what's the current requirement is not working and what needs to be changed.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. As this particular slide shows, the typical local residential roadway in Southport consists of right-of-way width of 56 feet which includes 2 10-foot lanes, 8-foot parking on both sides, 4-foot sidewalk, and a 6-foot planter strip in between the curb and the sidewalk. In this cross-section view, you can see that the curb is shown as part of the landscape strip, and therefore the landscape strip is only 5.5 feet wide on both sides. This section is specific to Southport since the typical local residential cross-section for the area north of Deep Watership Channel does not include separated sidewalk and a planter. The current landscape development guidelines do not specifically call for separated sidewalk with a planter. What it does require are street trees within 10 feet of the edge of the roadway within a 15-foot landscape planter. Landscape setback. The proposed landscape development guidelines would only require the landscape planters between sidewalk and curb on collectors and arterials, not on local residential roadways. The landscape planters on local residential roadways, which are within a community facilities district or CFD, generally include street trees and shrubs and ground cover, or turf in place of shrubs and ground cover in older areas. Per the current policy, irrigation for all plantings within the landscape strip and maintenance of the shrubs and ground cover or the turf is typically provided by the adjacent homeowner, while the street trees are maintained by the CFD. Suburban residential CFDs in Southport contain approximately 13,700 street trees, of which approximately 9,100 or 66% are trees within planter strips on local residential roadways. Landscape planters have multiple benefits. They do include a space for street trees, which eventually provide shade for the sidewalk and the roadway, thereby reducing the heat island effect. They also provide a physical buffer between pedestrians and vehicles. However, over the past few decades, we've also seen that the planter strips have some problems and drawbacks, which we'd like to discuss with you briefly. The first problem is damage to sidewalks. The tree roots from the planter strip trees seem to buckle the sidewalk as the trees mature, even though root barriers are installed at the curb line and at the sidewalk, to protect the concrete. Per current policy, adjacent homeowners are responsible to repair or replace damaged sidewalk along their frontage unless the damage was shown to be caused by a street tree within a CFD area. In those cases, city staff would contract to have the sidewalk repaired or replaced with CFD funds. In full replacement cases, the tree roots are trimmed, but in extreme cases, the tree is removed altogether to prevent future damage or future liabilities. Another planter strip challenge is poor drainage. Subdivision homes are generally graded to drain from the back of the lot toward the front, and that runoff ends up in the landscape planters, which have no way to release that water except through evaporation or infiltration. That poor infiltration is exacerbated by clay soil types in certain areas of Southport, which then retain the moisture and don't allow it to escape. So as I noted earlier, the homeowners are typically in control of the irrigation of the entire landscape strip along their frontage, as well as their own lots. So any overwatering of the landscape strip or the lot in general can lead to ponding water within the landscape strip, which can damage or kill the trees and make them more susceptible to pests. On the other hand, during recent drought years, in which water conservation requirements were imposed, our city residents did a really good job of complying overall with the water restrictions, but we also lost numerous trees in the planter strips, and those were lost based in part on a lack of water during that time. Still on the subject of irrigation, state water efficient landscaping requirements have been in effect since 2010, and the city's water efficient landscape ordinance, or WELO, was adopted in 2011. The WELO applies to most new developments, including subdivisions, and it encourages low water use plants and water efficient irrigation design, which is based on state standards. The subdivision developers, which have been subject to this ordinance, have designed their street frontages to comply with the landscape planner, with the WELO, including the landscape planter strips, which are irrigated by the homeowners. In those areas, over-irrigation is generally not a problem, but we still see overwatering issues occasionally in older neighborhoods that were not subject to the WELO. And one other issue that's vying for space within the overall right-of-way is a recent requirement by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's also in the California Building Code. It involves the addition of 5 foot by 5 foot or T-shaped passing spaces at 200-foot intervals on sidewalks which are less than 5 feet wide. So sidewalks with a minimum width of 5 feet or more would not require the passing spaces. Therefore, this requirement would only apply specifically to the local residential roadways, since the city's current standard for sidewalk width for local residential roadways is 4 feet wide. A few ways to meet this requirement are noted in the staff report. However, the most consistent way to deal with that requirement is to provide 5-foot sidewalk, which is more comfortable for pedestrians either passing each other or walking side by side. The whole accessibility requirement is not a subject for tonight's discussion. It will be vetted in way more detail when staff takes up an update to the city standard specifications and details. But we mention it tonight and in the staff report, since the planter strip options that we would like to discuss with you include the best case scenario of that 5-foot wide consistent sidewalk width. So at this time, we'd like to have Seamus come back up and go over some of those options for planter strip modifications with you.
Yeah, so as Wendy mentioned, there are some challenges with the current streetscape. So we've identified a few different options to go over. The first option is to remove the landscape strip entirely. The benefit of this is you don't have the buckling in the sidewalks, but you don't have any shade along the street. There's a 10 to 12.5 foot public utility easement required back of sidewalk, and this local residential streetscape would be in our areas that are zoned single family, which predominantly have 15-foot building setbacks, and home builders usually build pretty close to the setback line. So that doesn't leave much room for a tree, and if you did put a tree in there, it's going to be right up against the foundation, which is not going to get a very large tree. So this is one option. This would be reducing the right-of-way width from 56 feet down to 47 feet. One benefit of this is it's easier to get out of your car loading and unloading, because you have the curb, the sidewalk is right there. You don't have any landscaping in your way if you're going to get in and out of a car. So that is one benefit. And you can see here the 5-foot sidewalk and half-foot for the curb is shown. And all these options we have show a 5-foot sidewalk. The existing standard is the 4 feet. So going on to the next option, would be to expand the right-of-way to 61 to 63 feet and then retain the landscape strip on both sides. The consultant that prepared our landscape development guidelines recommends to have 7 to 8 feet for the minimum width for a mature tree, for a healthy tree that doesn't buckle the sidewalk. And this option has that on both sides. Now, the drawback of this is you do have to expand the right-of-way. So you're taking away more space for right-of-way is less space for private property. So moving on to the next option would be to retain the same right-of-way width as we have right now, 56 feet, and have a street tree, but only have it on one side. So you're pretty much combining the landscape strip widths from either side and putting it all on one side. And we'd recommend that this be on the southern or western side of the street to maximize the shade on the sidewalk and street. And this is what we're recommending, the proposed option, having a 9-foot wide planter strip with a half-foot there for the curb on one side of the street. And then the next option is kind of a hybrid of this one, where you have a 7-foot wide planter, and then to help to balance out the street, you have a 2-foot planter for shrubs or flowers on the other side that helps to balance it out. So we are looking for the Commission's input on these streetscapes and also the rest of the document that's under the purview of the Commission. So we are happy to answer any questions. This concludes our presentation.
I've got a question. How are these right-of-way widths arrived upon? Because, obviously there's an infinite number of widths that one could select between 47 and 63 feet. How did you choose 47, 56, and 63?
So the 47-foot width is essentially just removing the landscape strip on both sides. And so you end up going down from 56 feet down to 47. The expanded right-of-way, 61 to 63, is putting in a 7 to 8 foot landscape planter on both sides, which is the recommended width from our consultant. And the other ones are just maintaining the same 56-foot width, but kind of moving the planter strips from one side or the other to stay within the 56 feet. There was no real attempt to say, I'm going to fit everything into 61 feet.
If I may, I got to say, the one I liked the most was option number 2, expanding the right-of-way to 61 to 63, because I really feel that we do need trees. If we can have them on both sides, then my second option would be the 56-foot right-of-way and have it at least on one side. But least favorite is the, removing the landscape strip.
Okay. Did you consider actually putting the wider planter strip in the median, like on 22nd Street or T Street in Sacramento?
One of the reasons we didn't really go there is because you have driveways on both sides of the street, and so we would have to start thinking about, well, how do people, if they're going down one side of the street, you can't access the left side of the street. You'd have to go down and come back. So it would be a major change to circulation, whereas these don't require the change to circulation.
Okay. I think it would also, though, tend to lower speeds on the streets. So that's an option too. I do like the proposed alternate B, and would maybe even suggest that you could take that and then the one with the small planter strip on the other side. But I think that just having that wider strip on one side would make it clearer to people that that was the city's property and not theirs.
I'll just put another plug for proposed alternative B. I mean, I do like the 63-foot, whatever it was, right away, so that you can have trees on both sides. There's obviously some trade-off there in terms of costs and secondary costs to affordable housing. But I do think if things are going to change from trees on both sides to trees on one side, that it's nice to have some landscaping on the other side of the street. Any further comments or questions?
I'll just say that I also prefer option 2. I actually live on the corner and have one of those planter strips that we maintain, and very much appreciate the buffer for pedestrians from the vehicular traffic. And I'm all about the trees. I know there's some challenges with those, but given the climate crisis, I think more trees the better, soaking up CO2 from the atmosphere. So go with option 2.
I'll go ahead and chime in as well. I like the option 2, the tree and the planter on the other side. My big concern about I definitely like trees. My concern about the expanded landscape in attachment 4 would just simply be that it's so wide, and I hate crossing really wide streets already. So it bums me out when roads are the size of a football field, and I can see a bunch of houses where that road could have been. So, I like trees and some shrubs. Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, let's do, it should be agenda item 5A, Environment and Utilities Commission calendar. Our next regular meeting is scheduled for December 9th, 2019. Do we have any reports from city staff?
Just one item. We'd like to invite the commissioners and members of the public for America's Recycle Day event. That'll be happening November 16th, 2019. It's a free event. Waste Management is hosting this event, and just come by. Bring your family. Should be fun. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there any future agenda item requests from members of the commission? All right. Hearing none, we are adjourned.